Hello and welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one big idea or chapter or two at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
And across the internet and the continent from us is our guest co-host today, Micah Belong. Micah is the minister of the Llama Pack Alternative Church, a home for queer, leftist, deconstructing people left on the outside, and the host of the leftist Bible study podcast, The Word in Black and Red, which, if you enjoy this show even a bit, you will freaking love their show. Micah, we are so glad you're here.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's the word in black and red because the joke there being that there are lots of folks who like to only read the words in red, only the things that Jesus says, right, and think that should define us, which is good, right? We should definitely follow the teachings of Jesus, but the whole story is trying to reveal what salvation means, and by salvation I don't mean running away and getting off into heaven. I mean what it means to live a liberatory life. And so I love having the Brandons on my show, and as we discuss each passage of the Bible to figure out what's going on there. And I always love coming on here as well. I think that we're currently going through the book of Leviticus, and so I reference back to my notes in our conversation on Romans 1, where we talk about the clobber passage there that's used against queer people. And so I deeply appreciate that y'all made me sit down and actually write out those things so that we could have
good.
So, really, 7 years of thinking about these things culminated in that conversation.
It's amazing how that happens.
Yeah. So y'all are going through the entire Hebrew scriptures. Is it one chapter at a time?
It's sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. So it depends on the thematic elements. So if you listen to our Exodus has not yet released. We're working on that. All of our editors are volunteers, and so it's a wonderful team. But it's all new folks, and so we're figuring out how that works. But some of our later episodes in Exodus are like, we're going to take all of this stuff that's all about the temple and what colors it's supposed to be and all that sort of thing, and we're just going to smash that into one episode. But there's also some episodes that are like, okay, we're going to talk about these 5 verses because that story is so important, and how does that story affect the way that we are supposed to live our lives today, and how can we resist the lesson that story might be telling us if it's something that doesn't align with our values as Christians and as leftists.
Awesome. Well, we are going to be talking this week about Matthew chapters 7 and 8 in the Liberation and Inclusion translation. If you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, for those watching, what's that?
We're 8 and 9.
Hey, good Lord. This is what happens when I'm ramping down my caffeine intake and I just fall apart. We're talking this week about Matthew chapters 8 and 9 in the Lit Bible. If you haven't had a chance to read it in the Lit version, for those watching, we're going to have it up on the screen momentarily. And for those of you listening, we highly encourage you to read it through in the link in the show notes. It's on litbible.net/Matthew-8. It's that simple of a URL. Well done. So yeah, go ahead, hit pause, and don't forget the footnotes. There's a lot of important nerdery in there, places where subtle liberatory translation shifts can actually be pretty explosive. So that's where a lot of the payload is. We'll be right back. All right, so we have 2 chapters with a very fast pace of stories of it's right after the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is going from one person to the next to the next. In fact, there's one stretch where it's like, I'm talking to one person, but that somebody else interrupts and I get pulled away to this. And then somebody starts arguing and then eventually gets to heal the first person. Let's just kind of go through the narrative as it's presented. So, first
Yeah.
piece is the leprosy healing, verses 1 through 4. Actually, let's make it a point to read a few of these. That
Yeah.
would probably help. Would
Yeah.
the translator be
You want
so
to start
kind
with
as
that
to
one?
grace us?
Sure. Yeah. After Jesus came down from the hill, large crowds followed him. Notably, someone with leprosy went up to him and bowed down to him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can cleanse me. Jesus reached out, gently clasped him with his hand, and replied, I am willing. Be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Then Jesus said to him, Be sure not to tell anyone. Just go and show yourself to the priest, and bring the offering Moses instructed as evidence for them.
Yeah. I love this if you are willing, I am willing statement here, where, you know, what we will is so associated with who we are, right? That um, I want to do this thing because it's a part of my nature, is the way that a lot of people would have described something, right? I want to be a part of a family. I want to be a parent because it is in my nature to want that thing. Um, and that sort of willingness is in this ancient concept so associated with being that, in fact, a lot of the early church got into really big fights. And one of the early schisms is whether or not Jesus had one will, being
Hmm.
a combined will with his human will and his godly will being the same thing, or two wills, where he had one will that was human and one will that was divine, and sometimes those things were in contrast with each other. And that debate is deeply tied into Jesus's nature because of the way that they think about these things. And so I say all that because if you are willing implies if you are this way, if you will be what you will be, which is connected back to the name that God gives to Moses in the burning bush, Yahweh, which translates as I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And so, here it is this deep confession that I think a Hebrew or a Jewish audience would have heard reflected through the story that we don't hear a lot of the ways that this is translated. So I love this choice that you've made here, to say, if you are willing, and I am willing.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's amazing how much payload there is in just like a couple words here. Yeah.
I found it interesting that so in like disability rights circles and conversation, there's a distinction between the physical disabling experience and the social, the cultural, the economic, the way that society disables somebody because they have a mobility thing or a visual, whatever it is,
Right.
or neurodivergence. And those
Mhm.
are distinct. And I see that distinction in this story where Jesus resolves the leprosy, this like chronic and terminal illness. Um, but in terms of like resolving, like there's real consequences to if you don't, if you want to resolve the social disabling experience, it's not enough to just not have the disease anymore. It's like, you know what, go through the right hoops
Yeah.
so that you'll be
Mhm.
actually fully welcomed back into your world.
Yeah, that makes me think of the kind of this what I was thinking about for this whole section that we're doing today is
Hmm.
a lot of these things have to do with that like social theory of disability.
Yeah.
Um, Not all of them are about disabilities, but they are all about like all of these stories are about people who were excluded from social norms, from temple worship, from inclusion in just acceptable society in various for various reasons, whether it's diseases or because they're a Roman, or because they're haunted by demons, or all these things, right? And Jesus consistently just like does not care about who's
Mm.
supposed to be included, who's supposed to be excluded by social norms, and just responds to each person as a human being, and it's
yeah. I think we're gonna find that drumbeat pretty quick here.
Yeah. I also think, this we're currently in the middle of recording our season on the book of Leviticus, and we talk about skin diseases. There's a large section of the book of Leviticus devoted to how do you take care of these kinds of skin diseases. And something that one of our guests there pointed out is that the skin diseases that they're talking about there, we as contemporary readers hear of as leprosy. And so oftentimes that word is used in Leviticus. In the Common English translation or Common English Bible that we read on the show, it is translated as skin diseases because leprosy is probably not what they're talking about. And by the time that they get to Jesus's time, around, somewhere between 1,000 and 400 years later, the concept of leprosy refers to a different set of diseases, probably a group of diseases that are all related to the skin, but possibly quite different. And that form of leprosy, since in the 2,000 years since the writing of the Gospels, we also understand as different sort of diseases. And so there are, quote unquote, leper colonies, or were leper colonies that existed until the 1970s, where people were thought to, be able to give this disease to other people, not realizing that it is largely genetic and had nothing to do with the leprosy here in the Bible. And in either case, right, probably nothing to do with either of the set of diseases that are called leprosy. And so it's interesting that we have all of these different diseases that probably should be treated in wildly different ways, not by separating people out, but by providing them with the care that they need to be able to survive. But our society does the disabling by assuming it is this kind of disease, and therefore you can't be with us. And it brings me to mind of people who have AIDS, right? Where the AIDS crisis in the 80s, in particular, people were afraid to be around queer people because they thought that first off, you could catch it. And second, that it was only something that affected queer people. And so, it just all of those things, the current conversation about autism is another thing that I think is one of those things. Well, we assume there's something wrong with you, and so you should stay over there. And we don't have a way of describing the way that you are different from us in a loving way. And so I do love that here, that Jesus is saying, as y'all were saying, go through the hoops, go to the thing that signals, no, I belong in the community again, because the problem isn't necessarily the disease. The problem is far more the way that you were treated because you are different than the rest of them.
Yep. Absolutely. Which is so much about what cleansing ends up being, is about doing things to be considered right socially, spiritually, not about being bad or good, right?
Yep.
Like it's am I responding to the situations that happen because I had sex and came, right? Like it's, or because it's a moment on my period, like am I doing the things that are showing that I'm responding to these situations responsibly, or not being bad or good.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And the temptation to see bad or good certainly shows up with the sound of the Imperial March playing into the next narrative, the healing of Centurion's boy. Brandon, could you read this one as well?
Yeah. When Jesus arrived back in Capernaum, a centurion took him aside, pleading with him, "Lord, my attendant is laid up at home, paralyzed with torturous pain." Jesus replied, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion responded, "Lord, I am not worthy of having you come under my roof. Just say the word, and my attendant will be healed. I am also a person under authority, and having soldiers under me, I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my attendant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard that, he was impressed. He told his followers, "I'm telling you honestly, I haven't found anyone in Israel with as much trust as this." Hear when I say, many will come from east and west to share a table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the heavenly reign. But the natural heirs of that reign will be thrown out into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth in anguish there. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, exactly what you trusted to happen will happen for you. And the attendant was healed right then. Word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. I have to say, I think that this is probably the word that I have most disagreed with your translation on, and that's because attendant is really, it's fine. I don't think it's what it's trying to say. I think that this is one of the stories that is clearly queer coded in the book of, in the Gospel of Matthew, that is attempting to communicate something about those outsiders that would have been more obvious to the people who are reading this text. Because the word here, attendant, is pais. And pais, outside of the biblical text, is almost always in context of a younger lover, the boyfriend, the younger boyfriend in a lot of these situations. And that's what it's commonly used as. But people make a biblical argument that Koine Greek is different from the way that those other Greek folks were using it. And if that was the only thing we had to rest on, I would say, okay, that's fine. But then in verse 9, it talks about how the centurion has authority. He is the boss, right? He is on top of all of these soldiers beneath him. And then he describes his relationship with his younger boyfriend, his pais. Do this, and he does it. He's describing a submissive relationship where he's on top and the attendant is on the bottom. And what's so strange about this relationship is that the centurion deeply cares for this person, right? That in a lot of the reason why ancient Jewish people would have condemned homosexual relationships is that they would see, especially in the Greek context, a relationship of pederasty, of an older man and a boy, often, where the older man was sexually abusing the younger man, and that was normative, right? The problem really there was that the older man didn't care about the younger boy at all, right? And and also the pedophilia is also pretty bad, right?
Also,
but
side note.
Yeah. Hear me say, very loud note, right? But they would see these relationships as not loving because they were abusive, and they were a way that you were used and then tossed away, right? And here, instead of the pais being used and tossed away, the centurion, who has all of this authority, comes and submits to this Jewish guy, to one of the people who he was there to oppress, to have power over. And the centurion is willing to submit to Jesus. It's one of these wild reversals that are so common throughout the gospel, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And this centurion loves this pais so much he's willing to do that. That's not something you do for an attendant. That's not something you do for your assistant. That's something you do for someone you love. And so I think that those three things there together, the fact that pais is almost always referring to a younger lover, the fact that the centurion explicitly describes the relationship as one of a top and a bottom, to apologize for that rather obvious use of term there, and the fact that the centurion loves him so much that he's willing to do this. Those all, to me, are a sign that attendant is not a word sufficient for what's going on here.
Yeah.
Makes
sense.
It's like his the first step towards the kind of faithfulness Jesus is like invoking, of subverting power and domination through love, was already underway. The centurion is in a context that is normatively one of domination and exploitation in sex, and as an imperial dude. So he's already, with having this love for this person he should be objectifying and exploiting, that's already leading him to want to like step outside of a power hierarchy.
Yeah.
And then, yes, to come like under, like, here's like you are some of the dominated people, the Jews. Here's this wandering Galilean. So, and he's like, please help my boyfriend.
Yeah.
It makes a kind of sense of that exchange of I've never seen a faith like this in my own kin people, my own kinfolk. That that line is so remarkable, but I've never heard anybody give a particularly coherent answer about it. It's like this like vaguely anti-Semitic sense of like that's just so how so wayward the Jews were. What the fuck? Like if it's he's doing this double subversion of domination that's leading him to ask for help for someone he loves.
Yeah.
That's a kind of faithfulness embodied and a self-forgettingness in love. Yeah, that's not something you find among any people very easily.
Yeah.
It sounds way better than the anti-Semitic shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also it would be the only time I can think of throughout the Bible where someone submits power for their spouse.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Except maybe Joseph, but you know, he's the Joseph and Mary are the exception to every rule in the Bible. So
Also true.
Yeah. Yeah, as the oppressor, to be willing to flip everything upside down here, like that makes much more coherent sense of this story than, like you were saying, Brendan, than anything else I've ever really heard, other than just like, oh yeah, he was willing to humble himself to Jesus. So, like, yeah, that's good. But like to be willing to completely upend everything for the sake of love, right? Like that letting go of power, letting go of status, letting go of domination for the sake of love, like that's the gospel, right? So
yeah. So, you know, I don't have a better word necessarily here. The only word that comes to mind is submissive, because I think that that's the only way in our language to sort of get the double meaning there. But even that has more sexual overtones than I want it to. So,
Lord, my sub is laid up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I bet he is. Yeah, if you could just add a wink emoji after the word attendant, that might resolve it.
Yeah.
What do you guys do with this like natural errors like thing where it's like, I mean, it sounds like, but you know, the Jews are gonna be thrown into the outer darkness. Like, how do you live with this?
Yeah. It's one of these texts, you know, it's one of the problems of anti-Judaism that comes up as a result of the burgeoning split of Second Temple Judaism, right? So for folks who aren't familiar, Second Temple Judaism is the religion that Jesus is raised in, and it has lots of different factions that exist, like the kinds you see here in the Bible. The Essenes, who were separatists, who would go off into the wilderness and live on their own, who probably were the people who had the Qumran documents from which we have a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And possibly John the Baptist was one of them. Maybe, we don't know, but there's a good argument for it. You have the Sadducees, who were the people who were in charge of the temple and had the sort of political power and sway with the Roman government to keep in power. And you had the Pharisees, who were a democratic organization who were going out and saying, no, we don't need to go to the temple, which has, you know, kind of been compromised by the compromises that the Sadducees are making with the Roman Empire. And instead, we have to go back to the book. We have to go back to the Torah. We have to go back to our traditions. And how do we democratize these things in local areas? And so instead of having everyone go to the temple, well, they still did go to the temple, of course. They also had local synagogues where people would be able to gather and worship together in their own community, particularly in the area in which Jesus was raised, Galilee. Now, if you are not a scholar of Roman imperial Judea, you had three different regions, right, that were considered Jewish regions by the Romans, not necessarily by the Jews, and at the bottom of this area was Judah proper, was Judea proper, and above that was Samaria, where the ancient kingdom of Israel would have been. And the descendants of the ancient kingdom of Israel were called Israelites, but eventually they were named after the capital of Israel, Samaria. So they are called the Samaritans. And that's why the Samaritans and the Jews had such a huge clash, because the Samaritans said, we don't need to go down to Judah to worship. We can worship at our own areas. And so the Pharisees are interestingly sort of they agree with the Samaritans. You don't have to go to the temple necessarily as the only place to worship. So you had Judah, Samaria, and then above you had Galilee. Galilee is the most backwater. It's the farthest away from Judah. It's the farthest away from the seat of imperial power. And so there were a lot of Pharisees up there who were causing the movement to grow and develop. And that is probably the people who taught Jesus so much about the Torah, which is why so many of Jesus's teachings sound like the rabbinical school of Hillel, which was the dominant rabbinical school of the area of Galilee. Jesus's greatest commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself, is directly taken from the school of Hillel. You can find documents where they said that first, and Jesus is copying and pasting over. It's almost like you can get truth from things that aren't just the Bible. But all that to say that the Pharisees, when the temple is destroyed, the Essenes, the Sadducees, and then another group, the Zealots, who were basically like, we just fuck Rome, we're going to be free. Those groups, when Rome came in and destroyed the temple, they lost basically any tie to the traditional religion. The Essenes didn't necessarily believe in procreation, and so they died off. Sadducees and Zealots weren't able to mount themselves. A lot of Zealots were killed. And so the only group that were staged to be able to move from there were the Pharisees, and then this small burgeoning movement of Jewish Christians, people who saw Jesus, thought he was the culmination of the religion that they had been worshiping in their life, and so began to follow him. And so Pharisees and the early Jesus followers became Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and those two forces, as they move forward, were very opposed to each other. But the rabbinic Jews, far outnumbered in terms of Jewish population, the Christian Jews began to go out and through Paul minister to Greeks and Gentiles and everything, and began to grow outside of Jewish people. And when they did that, they carried a lot of their familial rivalries with the rabbinic Jews and clashed with them there. And so as we're reading these sort of things in verse 12, where the natural heirs of that reign will be thrown out into the outer darkness, it is early Christians, early Jewish Christians, Matthew is probably a Jewish Christian, who is rejecting other Jewish people because they haven't accepted Jesus as their Messiah. But then it gets taken up by a whole lot of people who are not part of that familial dispute, and is used to justify all sorts of anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years. And that is something that we as Christians absolutely cannot do if we agree with Rabbi Hillel, and incidentally, one of his students, Jesus of Nazareth, that you have to love your neighbor as yourself, which is to say, how in the world are we supposed to translate this verse? And to me, I think that we have to say, this is a part of our history. This is something that shows us how we shouldn't be treating other people. And also we can say, who are supposed to be the natural heirs of that reign? Well, the natural heirs of that reign are supposed to be all oppressed people. And yet our systems have left oppressed people out in the outer darkness. this is happening right after, or in the middle of this story, where this person has given up, the centurion has given up his authority and power, and so he is entering into the kingdom, whereas these people who are unwilling to give up the little bit of power that they have will be tossed out in the end.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how this is in some way a kind of apocalyptic coded
Yeah.
way of saying don't miss out on the good thing. But it's like that's some pretty hard way of saying don't miss out on the good thing. And it's not it's sort of this worldly judgment language. It's not this is not language about being thrown into hell or Hades or purgatory or whatever. It's about this side of one's death and a people's death. It's almost saying there is going to be a kind of death that y'all seem headed on. And, this is going to really escalate towards the end of Matthew, where he's like, y'all keep, like, that temple's going bye-bye, going down the path you're going. Like, you keep fixating on this violence thing. It's going to get dark.
Yeah.
And you see, like, that dripped throughout the text. It's just it feels culturally alien.
Yeah.
And therefore, because of 2,000 years of not particularly beautiful tradition of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, codes my eyes to see that here. And some of it may well be, but I'm trying to give like I guess there's got to be something better, like effort at this.
Yeah. Well, and I also think it's important to root this in a very Jewish practice, right? Like this, go read Ezekiel, go read Isaiah, go read a lot of the prophets, and this is very much so similar language, right? That you'll be tossed out, that God will get rid of you, that all of these sort of things, and yet there is still a deep faithfulness of God to the people, and the authors of this gospel still believe that there's a deep faithfulness to those people. They just think that faithfulness is coming through the person of Jesus Christ, which is the biggest difference between the prophets and here.
Yeah. Connection that I'm seeing too between this section and the person with the skin disease before is when you're unclean, ritually unclean, you had to go outside the camp, right? And that's how I always take this outer darkness phrase, is being outside the camp, right? And the pattern that I've been seeing, first noticed it in Matthew and seeing it throughout everything that I've been translating, is the sense of redefining. Jesus and Paul are redefining clean and unclean as essentially like, how do you treat other people? How do you talk about and talk to other people? And the natural heir is essentially like the firstborn, who has the highest status, right? Like, so like the religious leaders have the highest status, right? And they're not clean because they're not treating people well. But this guy who's willing to give up his status for the sake of someone he loves, he's the one that's, even though he's a Gentile, he's the one who's actually ritually clean here.
That feels good.
Yeah.
So I want to move us along. The next one I want to take time to actually read aloud and explore is the couple folks haunted by demons, and the herd of pigs. Is there anything we've got between this exchange and that? There's Peter's mother-in-law and the cost of following Jesus and the stormy sea scene. Is there anything y'all wanted to make sure we played with?
I just think it's important to always note, as often as possible, that Matthew 8:20 tells us that Jesus was homeless, and every time we see a homeless person, we should be seeing Jesus.
Yes. Thank you.
That starts feeling resonant with Matthew 25 and whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Right?
Absolutely.
I find the exchange ironic because they wake him up from resting his head somewhere. And he's like, I ain't got nowhere to raise my head. Guess who's behind that one? But he's also actually sleeping in atop the sea, atop chaos, atop the place where the powers are overwhelming in apocalyptic language. Then we have this developed tradition of Jesus descending to hell on Holy Saturday. We see like a prefiguring of that here, where this is always what he's been doing, is descending into places of contention and agony, and being called to unfuck it, which I dig. And then he meets some people who are in a really tough spot. 28 through 34 of chapter 8. Brandon, again, grace us.
Yeah. When Jesus arrived at the shore in the area around the Gadarenes, two people who were haunted by demons were coming from the graves, and they confronted him. They were extremely aggressive, which made it so that no one had been able to travel by that road. Shockingly, they wailed and said, "What business do you have with us, Son of God? Have you come here to harass us before it's time?" A large herd of pigs was feeding in the distance, and the demons begged him, "If you banish us, send us to the herd of pigs." "Go away," Jesus told them. They left and went to the pigs, and, astoundingly, the whole herd stampeded down the hill into the sea and drowned in the water. The people feeding the pigs ran away, went into the city, and spread the news of everything that happened with the two who had been haunted by demons. And notably, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. When they saw him, they begged him to move on from their territory. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
This story's wild.
There's a lot going on.
I love the way that in 28 you have positioned this in the same way that you've positioned the people with disabilities, right? That they are not someone who is their foremost identity is not as a demon possessed person, right? But they are someone who is a person who is haunted by demons. And in the footnote, you note that it is quite literally demonized is a better way of saying this. And I think that is just so much how we treat people with disabilities, is that you are demonized by the society.
Wow.
I almost said Aubrey Plaza, but that's not right. That's not the name.
I mean, we could talk about Aubrey Plaza if you
want. Yeah, whole other thing. But Aubrey, if you're listening, we love you. But the way in which the show Maintenance Phase, that has Aubrey something on it, talks about fatness, right? Is that fatness is something that is demonized by our society. It's not actually something that limits most of us fat people from most of living. It is only the way that our society treats us that limits us from those things. And so many disabilities are exactly the same way. Most society is not set up to support people who have autism or who have ADHD, and so those of us on that spectrum have to cater and medicate ourselves to become quote unquote normal, rather than any part of society being adapted to help us, or adapting society so that our different way of thinking, which is a perfectly acceptable way of thinking. I accomplish a lot as someone who probably has ADHD. And my ADHD, the ways that my thought pattern works, allows me to see things and build connections that other people don't see, and so help me a lot of the ways. And if I get rid of that, if I medicate myself to be quote unquote normal, I will lose a way of thinking that contributes something meaningful to my community and society. Now here, I think that the people who are here, they're living in a graveyard. I absolutely love Scott McCandless's retelling the Bible version of this story, where he describes the story of this guy who has lost his wife and children. He fictionalizes the story, right? He takes the little hints that you get in the Bible and tells a bigger story through it. And in his telling, a wife, the demon-possessed person's wife, I'm just going to pause there and stop and say, this isn't Legion, so that's not actually who I'm talking about. But anyway, in his retelling of the story, there's this guy who loses his family. He goes out and he is mourning at their graves every day, and he can't bring himself to leave there, and so he's just living there. And it requires Jesus showing up, and instead of being afraid of this strange person who's crying out, who's weeping in the grave, who seems to be so different and foreign than us, Jesus just shows up, and instead of being scared off, is willing to be with him and being willing to love him in that place that he finds himself. But here, I love that demonized, and then I also love that above you have spirit breaths, which I think are different things, but but worth highlighting as well.
Yes, I've never been quite settled with spirit breaths, but it feels like the best I've figured out so far.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That the Legion detail is not in Matthew. There's a really punchy way of exploring this story that is very anti-imperial, very kind of coded ACAB kind of vibes, and all pigs are pigs. APAP. That's something else. Right. And
also bastards.
Yeah. Is that's in Luke, isn't it?
Yeah.
That version, yeah. I'm just disappointed that it's not here, because it's such a saucy way of telling it, where it's a coded story of Jesus exercising the imperial presence or energy and putting it into an unclean animal that then falls into hell, into this coded place of abandonment. Those details aren't there, but I still like to think that it is.
Yeah.
Instead, Matthew is censoring something else. There's something else important about why the authors took this long to tell it.
Yeah, it is a different story, but it still has to do with that uncleanliness. I think this really just ties up the story at the very beginning, where the person with leprosy is supposed to go and do the thing that allows them to be clean again. And here they're in the Gadarenes, which is an area that has enough Jewish people that it shouldn't have pigs, and so he is going in here and gets rid of these demons and allows the demons to go into something that was already unclean, and thus cleans out all of it by doing so. There's a whole section in Leviticus about how to take care of skin diseases, but they didn't really have a concept of demons like we do, and we don't have a concept of demons like Jesus does in this context. Right. And so that's why I highlight that I like the spirit breaths thing, because I think that it captures, I think, a little bit more of the almost fairiness that I imagine demons probably have in Jesus's context. But the point being, we don't know what's wrong with these people, right? We don't know if we're supposed to believe that there's such a thing as demons and that the demons were possessing them, or in my case, I suffer from major depressive disorder, and when I am in the midst of it, it feels like a demon is sitting on my chest and won't let me up, and that I can't breathe at some points, because the demon is so pressing down on me that I can't go anywhere. And I don't believe in demons, but if I did, I would think that depression was one of them. And so is it something like that, where you have some sort of mental health break, with some sort of psychosis that is happening here? Is that what Jesus is getting rid of? Or is this demon just very clearly an analogy for the Roman Empire? I think in Luke it is so much more clear. But here I think that it's less clear because it's also highlighting that story of the centurion, where the centurion is not the person you need to get rid of. It is the thing that is keeping the centurion a centurion that you need to get rid of. You have to get rid of the power associated with that centurion in order to be clean of what's going on here. On our show, we like to highlight the fact that the position of cop is the problem, right? The position of cop is what makes people who are serving as cops do moral evils and abuse power and hurt people. And when they stop being cops, then they are able to live into redemption and live into the salvation and live into the liberation that comes with not having a power that you were supposed to use against your fellow human being. The same thing with extremely wealthy people, where if you are willing to give up that wealth, that barrier that's keeping you from loving relationships with other people, then you stand in the need of redemption. You stand in the capacity for liberation. You stand as someone able to achieve the salvation of Christ. But right here, up above, it says that won't be easy. Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go, but I have nowhere to lay my head. At least let me go bury my father. Let the dead bury the dead. Those are obligations. Those are good things to be tied to. And Jesus says, even give those things up. How much more will those of us who are attached to things that are hurtful and hateful have to give up in order to be cleansed of these demons that have a hold on our lives?
Yeah, which makes me think of like this whole city that would rather keep their economic prosperity of their herd of pigs. That's probably their, somebody's livelihood, right? Somebody paid a lot of money and took a lot of time to care for these pigs, but there's people suffering here, and they would rather keep their assets than help people who are suffering.
That has nothing to do with the way that America currently talks about violence against property as somehow equal to violence against people, or worse than violence against people.
Right.
Yep.
It's telling that there's a parallel between like the exile of these people whose whatever internal experience is resulting in extreme aggression. That's also where they put their it seems like the village's economic life depended in some core sense on all those pigs.
Yeah.
And they kept them a little ways away from town. Like there was some shame energy about it too. And it's also near the graveyard. They're in the distance, it says, from where the graveyard and the demonized folks are. It's interesting to have those three parallels all being kept outside. And there's not even like a, hey, thank you for helping our pals. It's just like, kind of screwed us there, bro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Move along.
Well, and Jesus seems to say that property damage, when it means saving someone, is not only encouraged but required. Just putting it out there. I'm just saying what Jesus did. I'm not saying anything myself. Of course. I'm just quoting Jesus. So.
Take it up with the good Lord.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, let's move into chapter 9 here, where I would kind of break it up into 3 parts. There's the first 8 verses. There's some talk about deviation and healing, and then there's this exchange about feasting and fasting and wineskins. And then really the second half of the chapter is just this like wham, bam, 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 bam of different healings and contentious exchanges. So let's see if we can get through all 3. So the first 8 verses.
Yeah, this is when I think of these 2 chapters, this story is what I think of, actually. So after getting into a boat, Jesus crossed the lake and went back to his own city, Capernaum. Notably, people led him to someone who was paralyzed and laid out on a cot. After seeing their commitment, Jesus said to the one who was paralyzed, "Take heart, child. Your deviations are released. Revealingly, some of the Bible scholars said to each other, "What he's saying is disrespectful." When Jesus understood what they were thinking, he said, "Why do you hold on to such oppressive ideas in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your deviations are released, or to say, get up and walk?" So, to show you that the Son of Humanity has the authority to release deviations, then he told the one who was paralyzed, "Get up, carry your stretcher, and go home." And he got up and went home. When they saw that, the people were shaken, and they praised God for giving that kind of authority to people. Word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So why is that the story that grips you?
Yeah, it feels like similar to kind of the theme of clean, unclean, this sense of deviations here. There's no hint in the story about the paralyzed person having done any harm to anybody, broken any rules. There's nothing there. How this person is deviating is by being ritually unclean because they're paralyzed, because they have some kind of injury or condition that's chronic, and they're not able to participate in society in the way that everyone's supposed to be able to do that. There's something unwell here, and it's not this person's fault.
Hmm.
And so it's deviating from all things being well, but not as a moral failing, not as having done something wrong, broken a rule. And I think that is kind of what this whole two chapters is about, is example after example after example of people who are off of the trajectory of all things being well or ritually unclean by no fault of their own.
Yeah,
And
like
Jesus includes them and highlights how anyone who tries to keep excluding them for those reasons are actually the ones who are unclean, who are actually the ones deviating.
Mm-hmm. What he's saying is disrespectful, say the Bible scholars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're resisting him including this person.
Yeah.
How dare you include this person? That's against the rules.
And that's an important thing with so it's in response to your deviations are released, which typically is translated your sins are forgiven. And the normative way of hearing the Bible is, and the voice of the tradition is that the core problem that this story is having God address through Jesus is that we broke the rules and we need some way out of being rule breakers. And sin is this endemic rule breaker status. And the twist is, particularly in the Gospels, sin language means quite a few things. Like you said, it's shorthand for having certain conditions that you were born with or that you developed that make you ritually unclean. It can include you did a naughty thing.
It can.
It can. It can be, yeah, like story coming down later, like a woman with a hemorrhage. And it's used in some sense. You hang out with sinners, with deviators. It's used in the code of a slur. It's a
Right.
slur. You're hanging out with all those queers. It's that kind of energy. Like this kind of squishy but formal like set of meanings for it. It now develops into, hey, if anybody's a rule breaker, hey, they're here illegally.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying that slur does not define you anymore. Your sins are forgiven. Your deviations are released. They're not just scandalized because only God can like shift your ontological status of forgiveness and now you go to heaven. No, it's who made you the person who said they can belong now? Bullshit. We determine that on behalf of God. What he's saying is disrespectful. You're disrespecting God's ordained people who make that call. We've got rules here, man.
Right. Yeah, it's the religious leaders who are the ones who are holding on to those deviations about the person, right? And Jesus says they don't get to decide that.
Yeah, stop living by their rules, brother.
And it goes to Matthew 16:19, where Jesus says, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Where binding and loosing is, again, one of these pharisaical traditions that becomes a rabbinical tradition of seeing something in the Torah and having some trouble with it. And so you need to bind it up, like with Sabbath, where the Pharisees had bound up the rules of the Sabbath so tight that you could never come anywhere close to violating the Sabbath because it was very important. So that's why some Orthodox Jews today will only use Alexa to turn their lights on and off because on the Sabbath, because they want to make sure that they don't touch it, or they would, have Gentiles come in and turn their lights in and off for them.
I did not know that.
It's also what
Jesus start a fire, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's also what Jesus does when he says that even hating someone is like murdering them. He's binding up the rule of murder so tightly that you can't even come close to accidentally murdering someone, because even just wanting to murder them, or even not even wanting to murder them, just disliking them enough that it even crosses your mind, is the same as murdering them. So he makes that a much higher bar, right? But with loosening, he loosens the rules on the Sabbath to say you can do good things, right? He also loosens the ways in which people are left out. And he leaves that to the church, that I think is really highlighted here in this text so beautifully. When they saw that, the people were shaken and they praised God for giving that kind of authority to people. It makes me think of this argument that I think is in the Talmud. It might be in the Mishnah. Where there are these rabbis that are sitting around arguing, and they're arguing about whether or not I'm going to get this wrong, but it's whether or not this particular oven is kosher to cook it. And there is one guy who keeps saying, yes, it's kosher. And then all the other rabbis are arguing, no, it's not kosher for this reason and this reason and this reason and this reason. And the yes kosher guy is saying, well, no, it's here. And when he does it, he performs a miracle, and the miracle shows up and totally baffles everyone. And then they go back and saying, no, a miracle is not sufficient evidence for this argument. It's not kosher. And so he does a bigger miracle, and they go, nope, even that is not a big enough miracle to overwrite what we as a group have come to consensus on. That's not a good argument. And so, no, it's not here. Finally, the rabbi interrupts, and God comes down from heaven and and says, interrupts and says, this rabbi is correct. And the rabbis say, no, God, you gave this for us to figure out. Your opinion doesn't count. And so
that's such a good Jewish story.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh and I am essential.
Yeah, you need to hear the story from a rabbi rather than me. I believe that story has been told a couple of times on our podcast by Rabbi Noyo. So go and search the word in black and red and listen to one of our podcasts that has Rabbi Noyo on it, Noyo. And she will tell you the story better than I have. And but all that to say that, like, this is something that in the Jewish tradition, pre-existing, this is a mechanism by which people are supposed to be working out their own salvation. And that is also what Jesus is trying to do, is trying to figure out, how do we allow this person to be a part of our society? How do we welcome them back into our society? And, I really struggle on whether or not we should give up the word sin, because I think that the word sin both means far more than the way that sin is talked about, and it also means far less than the way that sin is talked about. Like, sin is so many things. To Paul, it's one of the great powers that we have to resist. To the writers of the Gospels, it is both anything that makes you unclean and also a way of harming another person. And so, like, it captures all of these things in a way that ends up being used in an abusive way. And I'm wondering, do we abandon that word, or do we try to retake it for what it actually means in the context? And here, I think, I like deviations because it speaks to me a little bit about, again, that disability liberation theology. The one who is paralyzed, well, I'm removing your deviations. I'm removing the ways in which you've been othered. I'm removing this disability from you as a sign of my great healing. But I'm also taking away the ways in which you have been othered because of your disability. And so I like that here. I don't like it in page 5, in verse 5, because I think that there it is. I think that the word sins does so much more work. I think in the context of the paralyzed person, deviations is the right thing because paralyzed person has done nothing wrong to deserve this. And that's a central theme of Jesus' ministry, is that most people who suffer have not done anything to deserve their suffering. And yet Christianity is so often used as a justification for fucking over the poor because, well, clearly they deserve it.
Right. Yeah. Linguistically, one of my beefs with sin is that it doesn't reflect either the Hebrew or Greek words and what they mean. It's from the Latin word guilt, which is just not what the Bible's terms are about.
Yeah. But I get your word choice also evokes the kind of metaphor energy of the word.
Yeah.
Instead of it as a technical term. I appreciate in verse 4, why do you hold on to such oppressive ideas in your hearts? It's typically evil there. That really gets it.
Which poneros, the Greek word there, is about hardship. That's the core meaning of it. And it can get used in a lot of ways, oppression or just something that's a hardship that no one is causing in particular, or it could be moral wrong that is harmful, but it's about hardship at its core, not about I don't know, black-heartedness or something. The word evil just has its own whole ethos in our minds that's not really the focus of the word there.
So we've only got a few more minutes left this morning. And these two other sections here, in exchange 9 through 17 on the calling of Matthew and like feasting and fasting, and then that long string of healings and exchanges. Which one would you like to explore?
I think the next section is really, I think, ties it up what we've been talking about really well.
Great. Say more.
So again, my struggle with the word deviate instead of sin here is that in verse 10, when they're having this meal, that Jesus is seeing this person named Matthew who's sitting in a tax booth. Matthew's a tax collector. Another way of saying this in a leftist vocabulary is that he is collecting rents, right? Where the Roman government has a tax that they charge everyone, right? And then the tax collector makes their money by charging on top of that a fee for collecting the thing. And instead of charging the Roman government, as would make sense, they charge the people from whom they are taking the tax. And so they are stealing, right? They are not doing anything for their society. They're not adding anything to society. They are literally just taking from it. And it's the same. There are many modern parallels to people who collect rents, namely landlords, people who own something and they don't do anything to help better your life. They don't do anything to help make it a better existence for you rather than owning the home on your own. you could argue that they call somebody to come and fix your house for you, instead of you calling the person. But I'm willing to pay for that service if it means I own my home. But the all of that to say that, like, these are people who have really put themselves completely as the enemies of the people with whom they live. These are not just people who deviate from the good. These are considered the worst of the worst people in their society. And so, like, if we're going to toss around the word sinners, this would be the people against whom you would use the word sinners. And so, lumping in, and I think it's important because we lump in the people who are paralyzed who have done nothing wrong and the tax collectors into the same group, to realize and to amplify the way in which seeing people as sinners is just so fundamentally flawed. The idea that the sin you have done is the thing that should define you, rather than your belovedness by God being the thing that defines you, is really the problem here.
Yeah. Augustine, take notes.
Yeah.
Lord bless him.
Somebody needs to, because I won't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm much more inclined to curse.
Cast him upon the mercies of God.
I'm working on my relationship with Augustine. I'm not there yet.
I do appreciate his commitment to desire as being something close to the center of what we are.
Yeah.
It's just the way shame gets all screwy with that.
Yeah. And I also think that the way he talks about pride is something that is very convicting to me as someone who suffers from the sin of pride, and lives with that sin that I am hopefully working on. But yeah, I think that what is so important here is that these people come and eat with Jesus. And when the Pharisees notice this, they say, "Why does your teacher eat with these people?" Because, like leprosy, it was presumed that you could sort of catch someone's uncleanliness. You could catch someone's sinfulness, right? Or catch someone's deviations in these parlance. And the more I hang out with queer people, the more I'm like, yeah, I'm becoming more queer by hanging out with y'all, and this is awesome. But like that sort of sin as a sort of contagion, as a sickness, as a germ that you can catch, I think it's really undermined when you have a meal with someone who's different from you, someone who deviates from you, and you get to know that person and get to love that person. The biggest single thing that has changed the American perception and the world perception of queer people is just getting to know one person who is publicly queer. And that, I think, illustrates the fact that we have this deep humanity, we have this deep desire to love others. And when we get to see that humanity, instead of being afraid that we'll catch AIDS from them or we'll catch leprosy from them, then you begin to see God at work and God in that other person as well. I want to emphasize this because I think the next story, which is one of my favorite stories, I've preached on it multiple times. I think it's just a fantastic story. I think it's a completely different set of topics that wraps up what's going on here, but also releases us into a lot of what the rest of Jesus's ministry is going to be, with this importance of emphasizing the 12. And I say that we emphasize the 12 because the 12 tribes of Israel are so important, where we just have that difficulty with, how do we deal with these people that Jesus seems to say are going to be cast into the outer darkness. He then has this healing story where this woman who has bled for 12 years comes to him, touches his cloak, and is healed. And her faithfulness, her just showing up and touching him, not even having to talk to him, heals her. And then there's this 12-year-old girl who is, again, I don't know if it's actually in the Matthew story that she's 12, this 12-year-old girl who he brings back to life. And so you have this double emphasis that the 12 tribes of Israel are who this ministry is to first and foremost. And so they are not left out. They might be cast to the outer darkness for a little while, but God's faithfulness remains for them. And again, these sort of deviations, these sort of problems, are still things that are able to be redeemed. And I love the detail, the tassel on his cloak, that she grabs onto the sign of Jesus' Jewishness as a very distinct thing that Jewish people of his time, Jewish men of his time would have been wearing. She grabs onto that connection to his Jewishness, and that is what restores her.
That's great.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Let's end there. We are tight on time this morning, so we got to conclude there. We are so thankful for everybody's company on this leg of the journey. Thank you, Micah, for taking time out of your day to join us in exploring this sacred text together. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or review on whatever app or website or player, whatever you are enjoying this on, especially Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Got to feed the algorithms, tell the robots to tell others to check this out. So you can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. You can read the Liberation and Inclusion Translation at www.litbible.net and follow its development on Threads as @lit.bible. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Blue Sky as @litbible.net. You can follow me on Threads as @BDRhodes. I might have that on Blue Sky too. Micah, what's the best way for people to find you?
Yeah, The Word in Black and Red, wherever good podcasts are found. And we're on Blue Sky, Tumblr, and I think Reddit, and Instagram these days.
Awesome. Great. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Bye, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.